The moral vision of Israel's wisdom literature strikes a lot of the same notes that we hear in the law and the prophets. Now, the wisdom literature is a large and diverse collection of materials. And we're just going to look at one example this morning. But even looking at that one example will deepen our understanding of God's expectations for his people. So if you would, look there at verse 1. Notice what David does. He begins this psalm with a question. And it is, in fact, the question that we have been addressing all year long. It's just been reframed in the language of sacred space. Now, we don't think that much about sacred space in the Western world, especially in the United States, but we still have that concept. Think about, say, 40, 50 years ago. You're at church somewhere, and how do you think the elders would have reacted if some young whippersnapper had walked into the sanctuary carrying a foot-long chili dog that he intended to consume during the song service or during the sermon or whatever? In most churches, they would not have reacted very well, right? Because this is sacred space, right? Now, what David is asking is, who can reside within that sacred space? In other words, who can reside in the presence of God? It's an important question for all of the psalmists, because throughout the Psalms, residing in God's presence is exactly what we should want as worshipers. And residing in God's presence, the way that David constructs it here, assumes God's approval, right? So, David sets about answering his own question. But before we actually look at how David answers the question, we want to look at some basic categories of biblical moral reflection. And the reason is because there's actually some really important stuff that David doesn't talk about in Psalm 15. Okay? David doesn't mention violence. Now, fortunately, Proverbs 1, 8 through 19 takes care of that for us. It talks about how foolish and unhelpful it is to be involved with violent people. It's not just a sort of an abstract condemnation. Okay, my son, don't commit violence. Don't murder people. Don't commit armed robbery. Don't commit aggravated assault, to use our legal categories. No, he says sort of that very same thing by saying, don't associate with the kind of people who do that thing. Don't give in to their logic. Don't give in to their so-called wisdom. Hey, let's go hide in the bushes and jump out and beat somebody up and steal all their stuff. That's how the logic would go, right? The writer of Proverbs is saying, don't do that. And don't associate with people who do. Well, then there's sexuality. That's also not mentioned by David here in Psalm 15. Proverbs mentions it. Proverbs 5, Proverbs 7. And what's really interesting about those two chapters is they are interspersed, Proverbs 6, Proverbs 8, with wisdom, with conversations about wisdom and folly. Now, this is not uncommon. Throughout the scriptures, adultery or other forms of sexual immorality are used as metaphors for a sinful, idolatrous life. This has led some scholars to argue, well, God doesn't really care about these kinds of sexual transgressions, but people in the ancient world did, and so God uses it as an analogy. But it's not really his point. The problem is that the analogy is so pervasive. The metaphor, you can see it in Proverbs, you see it in the book of Revelation, you see it in Paul's letters, you see it in the Gospels. It is so pervasive that you begin to think, wait a minute, God uses this metaphor over and over and over again. Maybe he actually cares about the way that we behave sexually. Plus, this is not always true, but sometimes the metaphor doesn't just define the thing that it represents, it is also defined by the thing that it represents. Let me give you an example. Ephesians 5, 21 through 33 has this long conversation about marriage. And the idea that Paul is using Christ and the church as this, really what he's doing is using marriage as this metaphor for Christ and the church. Let me get this straight. He's using marriage as a metaphor for Christ and the church. And so marriage defines what the relationship between Christ and the church looks like. But the reverse is also true. Even though Paul says, well, I'm really talking about Christ and the church when I'm talking about this mystery, we all read that text and go, sure you are, Paul. He means the other two, even if he didn't realize it. He means that the way that Christ relates to his church defines the way that married couples relate to one another. It's not a perfect analogy. It's not a perfect metaphor. But that isn't the point. The point is that the two things are reciprocally related. So the Old Testament cares about violence. The Old Testament cares about sexuality. The Old Testament also cares about possessions. What we do with our stuff. What we do with our money. Now, this is mentioned very briefly in passing in our psalm. But the thing that our psalm focuses on most is this final category, conduct within the community. And in fact, it interprets that whole question of possessions in light of this other issue. How do we behave with one another? How do we interact with people? And see, that's an aspect of biblical ethics, of biblical morality, that we often don't consider. So, now let's turn our attention to the content of what David mentions to us here. And again, I think it's helpful to take what we're looking at and put it in some buckets so we can kind of make sense of it and apply it in a wide variety of contexts. So what's the first thing that David is telling us to do? You see it right there in verse 2. David wants us to have the right orientation to our lives. He wants us to be focused in the right direction. Okay? And what is that direction? It is blamelessness and righteousness. Now, we've already talked about righteousness quite a bit, maybe we'll come back to it for just a moment in a second. But I want to focus on blamelessness. Because when you hear a word like blameless, as individualistic Americans in the modern world, we tend to think that in terms of, well, I never messed up. I never do anything wrong. Well, now David would love that if you were able to say that, but we've all read the New Testament. We know that nobody can. So what does this blamelessness mean? What is it talking about? We got to remember, they don't live in the kind of individualistic culture that we do. So when they're talking about blamelessness, they're talking about your reputation in the community. Now, not only do we as individualistic Americans not consider that, we're often actively discouraged from considering that. How many times are we catechized, if you will? Use a good high church word. We're catechized by our culture to not think about how other people see us. People will tell us in the media or in our personal interactions. We'll even have coaches or parents tell us, it doesn't matter what other people think. All that matters is whether you're being true to you. Right? Well, you understand why people do that, because peer pressure makes people do some really wacky things, right? But the fact is, as humans, and we know this neurobiologically now, we are meant to live in community. And the truth is, there are some things that you cannot see about yourself. You need help. You need other people to see it. And what we're doing in our culture is we are actively encouraging people not to listen to criticism, not to listen to outside input. It made me think, I've listened to a Christianity Today podcast this week. And one of the hosts was an African-American lady named Nicole Martin. And she's very bright. She's very thoughtful. And there's lots of things in the news about race, right? And she said some things that made me a little uncomfortable, and that I'm sure would make some of us in this room a little uncomfortable. But all of a sudden I realized, oh, that's the point. When you hear a perspective from somebody who isn't like you, you're hearing how they see the world differently than you do. And so many times what we do is we try to insulate ourselves from anything that might challenge our preconceived notions. Now that happens on sort of the national level, the political level, the ethnic level, things that we do that we take for granted are, other people would just be terribly offended by. Same thing, in reverse. Sometimes we see things that other people do that we're just like, why in the world would you do that? But this also works on the personal level. Sometimes we think we've got it all together when in fact everybody around us knows we're one mean cuss. Blamelessness encourages us to a life that is worthy of respect and admiration. And then righteousness is kind of like the personal equivalent of that. Now, we've said before that righteousness is about doing right by people. And that's true. That's a good way for us to understand it. But righteousness isn't just a social construct. Righteousness is about just doing right, period. Now, let's remember that in the ancient world, they don't really think in terms of moral abstracts. That's something that we've kind of inherited from the Greeks and the Romans and etc. In the Old Testament, you're always doing what's right by somebody. You're doing what's right by other people, doing what's right by God. You're doing what's right by yourself. It's always in some kind of relationship. Now, there are some social scientists, easy for me to say. There's some social scientists who would tell you there is no public-private dichotomy in the ancient world. That's not true. It's not as big as what we're used to, but there is a public-private dichotomy. And what this does is it helps us kind of focus on both sides of that. Okay? So David's asking us to be blameless and righteous. That's what it takes to dwell in the presence of God. And then he starts to unpack a little bit of what that looks like. One of the things that it looks like is having the right values. Notice what he's talking about there when he says, that the person who dwells in God's presence despises a vile person, but honors one who fears the Lord. Now, we read that and we might be kind of thinking, wait. How does that fit under Christ's command for us to love our enemies? Doesn't that contradict with that command? And it's a good question to ask, okay? And we're going to come to that whole love your enemies thing in several weeks. And there's a lot to talk about there. But it is Christ's command. So what are we saying here? Well, what we're saying here is this. Who do you honor? And who do you respect? Who do you proclaim as being worthy of admiration? Or to use the modern terminology, who do you platform? A couple of weeks ago, I'll go back to Christianity Today. They ran an article criticizing themselves for providing a platform for J. Edgar Hoover back in the 60s and 70s. J. Edgar Hoover wrote something on the order of 11 articles for Christianity Today. The problem is J. Edgar Hoover was not an evangelical Christian. He was, as far as we know, not a Christian of any kind. He was a virulent racist. He did all sorts of things that today he would go to jail for a long time for. Misuse of government power, all of those kinds of things. So what we're asking is, and the thing is, the founding editor of Christianity Today, who was generally speaking a very good theologian, he was a Southern Baptist, he was a very thoughtful guy, taught at Southern Seminary for decades, very famous man, who generally speaking was a person of integrity, but he wrote these letters that just fawned over Hoover. We're supposed to be the kind of people who can discern the good from the bad, even when it comes to people. And we celebrate the good. Why? Because that says something about our values. How we use honor and shame, how we evaluate people, says something about what's important to us. And sometimes what we see is that we value power more than integrity. We value prestige more than honesty. We'll come to that in a moment. We value comfort and safety more than faithfulness. David's encouraging us not to be that way, to be the kind of people who value the right things. We can still love our enemies while also acknowledging that, Jeffrey Dahmer is not worthy of imitation. Now, I mentioned honesty a second ago. Let's move to the many faces of truth. Because this is what so much of Psalm 15 is about. Psalm 15 is about the way we use our mouth. And this is a theme that Paul picks up. It is a theme that James picks up. It is a theme that Jesus thought was important. How do we use our mouth? David wants us to be truthful people. He wants us to tell the truth. Now, we're not talking about being legalistic about it, okay? If you're too legalistic about it, you're going to have some trouble when you get to Jesus and he tells people, oh no, Jairus' daughter's not dead, when everybody in the world knows she is. Okay? But we are people who are truthful. We are scrupulously truthful. That's the kind of people that David's encouraging us to be, but it's more than that. He's also encouraging us to avoid malicious speech. We ought to tattoo that on the forehead of every politician in America. Now, sometimes malicious speech comes in the form of outright lies, right? You know? It comes in the form of intentional dishonesty, but not always. Sometimes it comes in the form of things that we don't know whether they're true or not, but they're just juicy enough that they're, to us, worthy of repeat. And sometimes speaking maliciously comes in the form of telling the truth, but slanting the context around that truth so as to make it a weapon. All of those things are out of bounds for the Christian. And this too is just as applicable as today's headlines. You will hear certain Christians defend the malicious behavior of certain politicians by saying, well, they're on our side, so it's okay. No, it's not. This is not who we are as Christians. We don't malign people, even our enemies. But actually, what David is talking about is more than about our mouth. It's about our hands and our feet, too. Do we do the truth? Do we keep our promises? When I was a child, my father would never make a promise. Now, kids sometimes they want their parents to make promises, especially if, like me, they're a little prone to anxiety. But Dad would never make promises. Why? Because he never wanted to be in the position of something happening where he had to break a promise. His word was his bond. And so if he had even the slightest hint that any uncertainty at all could come up about something, he would say, well, this is what I plan to do. But he wouldn't say, this is what I am going to do, and he would certainly never promise. Now, David doesn't tell us to never make vows, to never make promises. What he just says is, if you make one, you got to keep it. And you got to keep it even if it hurts. All of this honesty stuff, it's reminiscent of so much of what Paul talks about. If you go and look at Paul's vice list in Galatians 5:19 through 21, yeah, you've got the typical stuff about drunkenness and carousing and sexual immorality and idolatry and those kinds of things. But the middle of that list is all about this kind of stuff. It's about gossip and dissension and factions and all those kinds of things. Sometimes this is what living the Christian life is really about. This is what it means to honor God. So let's turn our attention to our conclusion. You've heard me say it before. It is very tempting for us to think that, well, if I don't commit the egregious sins, then I have fulfilled God's vision for me, for us. And that simply isn't true. Yes, God does care about the big stuff. The stuff that Proverbs talks about. But he also cares about those subtle patterns of behavior that shape our lives. A little dishonesty here, a little malice there. It can distort our very being if we let it. What God wants is for us to be people of public and private integrity. And he wants us to be people who live lives that are shaped by the truth. Let us pray.